Hello, can you introduce yourself and state your role?
Sure. My name is Brother William McMillan. The students and other monks around here call me Brother Will. I'm the head sacristan for the church at St. Mary's Abbey. Setting up mass and weddings and baptisms and funerals and stuff like that, and making sure uh, everything we need in the church we have. I'm also an English teacher at Delbarton School, which is the school that we sort of oversee. Um, I've taught for the last 8 years. I've taught freshman, sophomore, and senior English. I'm also an assistant middle school baseball coach. Um, and I've been a club moderator for a couple different clubs for a couple different years. So we have a pretty thriving ping pong club here. And also a couple years ago, we started up something called the Grappling Club. So a few years ago, a fellow monk who has since left, he's now working for a diocesan PA, got me into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then, a couple of the kids heard about it and they said, why don't we start a club here? So we do, Jiu-Jitsu and judo and wrestling and stuff like that. So that's pretty much uh, what I do here. Yeah.
Very cool. My brother is actually very much into jiu-jitsu, and he talks about um, kind of like there's an intersection between jiu-jitsu and philosophy and spirituality almost. Do you
Totally.
find that to be, yeah, you find that to be prevalent?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many crossovers. I've actually been throwing around the idea of putting together a retreat, maybe for like fathers and sons here, or even mothers and sons. We have an all boys school here, so um, and calling it grappling with God and having it be like a half spiritual, half grappling self defense retreat. Just the ideas of consistency, of sacrifice, of focus, of mindfulness. All of those things play really heavily into spirituality and jujitsu. So or martial arts more in general. There's a ton of crossover. Absolutely.
That's cool. That's a really unique, creative idea. I think, especially because you're dealing with like young men, I think that that's such a cool way to incorporate like activity and spirituality. And for me, anyways, because I've worked with students of different walks of life, I find that with a lot of male students, it's like shared activities like that, like a sport or like something like that is really where like a lot of like communication happens. So that's a really cool. I like that idea. If you guys end up doing that, I'd love to hear more about that in the future.
Yeah, just a
Yeah,
matter of me, putting something together. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so I feel like everybody has a really unique journey, especially when you end up becoming like um, clergy. Like when you end up really like taking vocational vows. I feel like everybody always has a really interesting story. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey to the church and what led you to a vocation in the Benedictine tradition. Like I said, my grandmother was a Carmelite nun. She picked that for very specific reasons. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your story.
Sure. I grew up in what I would just like consider an, American traditional American Catholic family. I'm the oldest of three. It was church on Sundays, going to CCD and CYO and making all your sacraments and praying before dinner um and so and I was just talking about this with some seventh graders at a school near us. I think for a lot of younger people, their early church journey can feel sort of obligatory, like, okay, this is what mom and dad asked me to do, so I do it. And then you find out as you get older that that's not going to sustain you, checking the box of going to mass and going to confession and, all that sort of stuff isn't really going to sustain you. And what's going to sustain you is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. A guy who he loves you more than you could possibly imagine. He wants the best for you and he wants to have a relationship with you. And that to me is really the foundation that we need to teach young people. And it's not really something that I felt like I got a lot early on. It was more like, we are telling you to do this, so you should do it. Um, and so, I went to public school up until eighth grade. I went to a Catholic high school called Seton Hall Prep in West Orange, New Jersey. Um, and I went off to Syracuse University, upstate New York, for college. And around that time, and I think this is pretty common among people that age, especially if you grew up Catholic, if you're a cradle Catholic, as we say, uh, that around that time, maybe you start questioning things about why do I actually believe this, or are there some disagreements I have with the church, or maybe I want to find out certain things that I really don't have a handle on. So I certainly did a lot of questioning and a lot of sort of reading about other religions and atheism and what do these philosophers have to say. And but I found myself even in that questioning going to mass every Sunday at college. I had a buddy who lives pretty close now that we were going to mass every Sunday. It was kind of an important sort of anchor for us. Um, and so I graduated college, wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do. I started as an English ed major because I wanted to go back to my high school and teach English and coach baseball. Took some ed classes, didn't like them, kept the English major, switched to a journalism major because I like to write and I was pretty good at it. Um, but after graduating, I got an internship at a bank in marketing, mostly like communications, press releases and speeches and stuff like that. And I worked there for 5 years. And that's really where my vocational sort of journey started, I would say. I was working for the bank and I knew when I was working that this was not something that I really wanted to do for the rest of my life. The people were very nice. It was a great company. It was an interesting time to join the company. But I just couldn't see myself, working in a cubicle 9 to 5 for the rest of my life. Um, so um, I remember having a really bad day one day, and people who are listening who are in the corporate world might relate to this. I was having such a bad day that I took my lunch to my car, and I was eating my lunch in my car, and I just kind of started praying. I just said, I need some guidance here. Do I look for a different job within the bank? Do I go back to school? I'm not, I don't know what to do, and at that time, I was probably around 25 or so. Um, so later that day, I'm leaving, and there's an unwritten rule in the corporate world that you don't leave exactly at 5 because, manager is going to think that you want to leave
Slacker.
at 5. Right, exactly. Now, I really wanted to leave at 5, so I was. And at that time, the president of the bank was walking, and I was walking out, and we crossed paths, and he knew who I was. We weren't sort of friends, but he knew who I was. And he was an Irish Catholic, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm just going to go. My shift's over." And he goes, "Well, why don't you think about going back to school for an MBA, and we'll sponsor you for an MBA." So I was like, "Whoa!" I just prayed about this, 5 hours earlier, and I'm getting this opportunity from this person. So I thought that that was going to be the path, and was going back to Seton Hall University after work toward an MBA. But even sitting in those classes, I was still like, this is not clicking for me. It's not, just doesn't feel right. And before an exam one night, I was walking past the chapel, and they were doing 24-hour confession, where they had a priest in there for 24 hours straight, a different priest. It wasn't the same priest for 24 hours. Um, and I had this overwhelming like thing well up in me, like go to confession, go to confession. I hadn't been to confession in a long time, and went into the confession, and had a good confession. And as soon as I walked out, it was like, why don't you think about religious life? I think the guys on my dad's side of the family tend to think about it. My paternal grandfather was in the seminary for a couple years, discerned out, had a family, had 5 kids. Um, and his brother, so my great uncle, became a priest. I think he was ordained in his mid 20s, and was a Passionist, which is just a different order in the church, like Benedictine or Franciscan. And he's now 102. So he's
Wow.
been a priest for a very long time. And then when I told my dad I was coming, he was like, come to the monastery. He said, I was thinking about becoming a priest, and then I met your mom, and of course, you can't do both. Um, and so, it's something I sort of, you know, obtusely thought about as growing up, like, okay, maybe, but never seriously. But when I walked out of that confessional, I kind of felt that well up within me. That was a sign to me to sort of start to look into this. So I went to Vision Vocation Network, which is a great website for young people discerning. Um, and you sort of fill out a bunch of stuff about yourself, and then my joke is like it's like the Tinder of religious life. It's like you're a 98% match with the Benedictines of Morristown. You're a 90% match with the Augustinians of Philadelphia. Those
Wow.
results, those results get it sent out to different communities around the country, and then you get mail. Like, hey, come check us out. We'd like to meet you. And one of those letters was from a priest named Father Giles Hayes, who was a graduate of Delbarton. Went to college, came right back as a monk, and was here his whole life. He was two Baptist master. He was the abbot of the monastery for a while. Um, so I visited and just kind of felt right, and visited another two times, and kind of just said, I'm in my mid 20s. This is why not try now? I don't have, I'm not in a relationship. I don't have, kids to take care of. So it's a good time to try it. And that was 2016, and I've been here for 10 years.
Wow. So you ended up finding your way specifically into the Benedictine like sector, if you will, like because you got matched through this like was it like a values based program or like how did they match you specifically to Benedictine spirituality? Like how did that come about?
It's very interesting. The questionnaire on Vision Vocation Network, I mean, I haven't checked it in a long time, but when I did it, it was, what kind of work do you want to do? What size
Oh,
community do you want to be in? How far from home do you want to be? Those kind of questions, and so it wasn't a thing where I was like, I think I'm going to be a Benedictine. It was more like, I have no idea how to navigate this. Just kind of see what pops up and
yeah.
what works for me. I knew I wanted to be sort of fairly close to home. I'm a half hour from my folks and 40 minutes from my sister. Um, and I knew, I could use my English degree to teach. I knew I wanted to coach. They have a pretty thriving athletic program here. So all those pieces just kind of came together through that questionnaire.
I find a lot of similarities in your story because I'm in marketing. So it's interesting that you went from that, which is like a whole, press releases and marketing and especially what 2015, 2016, right out of the gate when that stuff was like digital, really on the rise, right? Um, and then you specified that made me laugh. You said he was Irish Catholic. I also identify as Irish Catholic because Roman Catholic and Irish Catholic are very different in my opinion.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and my parents are from Jersey, so it's funny that you're mentioning all these places in New Jersey and these schools. I'm pretty familiar. My mom went to Immaculate Conception, which was like an all girls school, and then my dad went to, gosh, um, St. Francis for like middle school and yeah, I think elementary and middle school. So they have their Catholic school journey in New Jersey, which is funny to me. But that's a really interesting story. I feel like because I was surprised when you hopped on that you looked so young. I find that like um kind of similar to your grandpa and even my grandma that there was like I don't know, World War II era people, there were like a lot of younger people coming in and taking vocational vows. And then it feels like there was this big gap for a while where it was just mostly older people who were taking vocational vows. And I find that recently there has seemed to be kind of another um, like upspring of younger folks in their 20s and 30s who are now looking into that. And I feel like your story will really resonate with them because I feel like a lot of people, especially with the world that we're living in right now, there's a lot of like looking for purpose. And so I think that's a really interesting story. Thank you for sharing that with me. I think that a lot of people are going to resonate with that. Um, so, as you know, this our mission, Mary Lives, is specifically the founder Peter Sesso, and quite a few other members have had specific um, intervention. They feel that they've prayed to Mary specifically, and she has intervened on their behalf in their lives in some way. And so my question to you, to pivot a little bit more to like the missional cause of marylives.com, is what role, if any, has Mary played in your personal faith journey? And Marian devotion seems to be kind of a like controversial subject outside of the Catholic Church. How would you explain Marian devotion to somebody who feels kind of like hesitant about that?
Uh, to your first question, I'm a monk of St. Mary's Abbey, so she's our patron or patroness, and for me, my relationship with Mary, or why the way that I feel about Mary is that, she's kind of the personification of faith, humility, and obedience. She was brought this mission, as a young girl. She didn't know, what her yes was going to mean, but she had faith and she said yes anyway. A great example of humility in not only accepting that mission, but in carrying out that mission, right? So, she couldn't possibly know at the time that she said yes that, 33 years later, she was going to be watching her son suffer, a horrendous death, and, of course, a resurrection after that. But so tremendous humility, a tremendous example of obedience to God, and all three of those things are, super important in Benedictine life. Obviously faith for Catholic monks. We should have faith. I think that's a prerequisite for entering the monastery. And humility is a big thing for us. We follow the rule of Saint Benedict, and he writes a whole chapter on humility. And humility specifically as it pertains to your position in the community, your and how you approach your relationship with senior monks, um, and which of course ties into obedience too. So, for her, I think her life has so much to offer everyone, obviously, but Benedictine monks and nuns in particular, just a wonderful example of how to live a good, holy life. Um, and to your second question, someone who feels unsure about Marian devotion, if someone approached me and said, I'm unsure about this, I would ask them what they're unsure about, and then kind of go from there. I think when some people hear Marian devotion, especially non-Catholics, they hear you're worshiping Mary, which is really not the case. A devotion, I would say, is a form of veneration, not worship. Um, we can sort of honor her life in a deep way, but that's not the same as worshiping Jesus or God. Um, so I think that's an important distinction to make too, of like defining what devotion means. And I think that's where some people get tripped up, like, oh, you're worshiping Mary, and it's not quite that. It's more like honoring her in a deep way.
Yeah. And it's not just like you're praying specifically to Mary the way that you would pray to God or Jesus. It's like you're praying to Mary to intercede on your behalf as a messenger, as a mother bringing something to her son. And I find that, yeah, a lot of people who maybe are not super familiar with the faith can kind of conflate the two, as you said. And that's something that I think with marylives.com is like a really important distinction that we're trying to make, because it is Marian devotion specific. It is focused on that, but that's not to negate, the actual who we're actually worshiping, right? So Mary's, as you know, very much tied into the Rosary. And the one of the biggest missions of marylives.com is we have a meeting every Monday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern time, where we encourage people to hop on Zoom to pray together. And I think that this is really interesting because in the Bible, it states like where there are two or three or more, I am there, right? So while I think that there's a lot of benefits to like apps these days, like modern prayer apps like Hallow or something, because it really does help you to continue to practice your spirituality. I think that the act of praying in real time with like multiple people, there's something of value in that, right? Like that's not to put it on the same level as like a mass, but that is one of the reasons that a mass is considered so powerful, that there are people gathered in real time at the same time praying together. Um, and so we say the rosary. We do the rosary every Monday. And something that I've heard throughout my years in Catholic school is that the rosary is a spiritual weapon throughout church history. Like, very specifically, these words are used. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the rosary is called a spiritual weapon throughout church history?
Well, and I'm consulting my little cheat sheet here because I wrote some notes for the answer. So I don't want to.
No, you go. I mean, that's a big question, right?
Yeah. Um, if we can start, if you start to answer that question, if you start from the premise that prayer is a weapon against forces of evil, and the rosary is a tool for you to pray, obviously the connection becomes a little bit easier. Um, and I also like to think of it like symbolically of like, a lot of people carry their rosary in their pocket, or you see monks and friars and nuns have the rosary hanging off their cincture at their side. You know, it's something that you have at your side for your defense, right? That's like in medieval times where people might carry a sword or a weapon or something like that. So I think the connection is sort of there. And so, in that sense, it really is a weapon because it's a tool for you to keep away things that you don't want to enter your space or to enter your consciousness. Um, so that's the kind of short and sweet answer to that. Yeah.
Short and sweet is good because a lot of people that we're reaching out to may not really understand the power. Like, people understand that rosaries are there to help you pray, but like the spiritual aspect behind that, like you said, I think short and sweet is fine with that. So there are a lot of people out there who, and we're going to kind of get into this in a little bit. There's a lot of people kind of entering not just the Catholic faith, but like Christendom in general right now. There's an increased interest. And a lot of people are fairly unfamiliar with the rosary. So, for someone who hasn't prayed the rosary before, how would you guide them through that in a simple, approachable way?
I think the easiest way to access it initially is to do like one of these guided, video or like the Hallow app. Make it as easy as possible for the person. Don't just, here's your rosary, now pray it. Just so they can get a feel for sort of what it's about and what it's asking you to pray. Um, I think that's the easiest way for people to access it initially. Um, and I'm also a big fan of like, we've all seen the little booklets that, you might find at your parish about how to pray the rosary and using them as a guide. But then again, something like Mary Lives is so great because you don't have to pray the rosary all on your own, right? You can sit in on a couple sessions and listen to other people pray it, get a feel for sort of what goes on and what you might think about. Pay attention to what sort of comes up in you as you pray, and then go from there. So if someone came to me, no understanding of Christianity, of the rosary, of prayer even, I would say sit down and do this guided rosary and see what comes up and go from there.
I think that's good advice. I think you often enter like, I know for me, even though mass is very structured and the rosary is very structured, I'll find myself in a meditative state where, as somebody who has been to countless masses in my lifetime as a cradle Catholic school attendee, where I kind of end up, yeah, zoning out almost and seeing what comes up. I mean, still following along, but you enter kind of like a meditative state, and I think
Mhm.
that that's really interesting. So I'm going to pivot because you work with younger people right now. I mean, we're young, we're in our 30s, but like teenagers, adolescents, people who are coming of age. And if you take a look at the world right now, it's kind of wild, right? So, what do you find as somebody who's working with people who are coming of age are some of the biggest spiritual challenges that you're seeing facing these young people today?
When I was reflecting on this question, I thought of just the idea of voices. We all hear so many voices every day, and our parents, our siblings, the people on television, social media influencers, reporters and journalists in the newspaper or magazines, strangers, teachers, our priests, people we cross on the street. Um, and that to me is the biggest challenge. Not to say that, like, we shouldn't listen to our parents or our local priest or something like that, but um, a relationships with Jesus starts with listening to what he might have to say to you. And that involves getting very quiet and being very attentive and getting very focused. Um, and that's a really hard thing in a noisy world, and I think that is partly what a monastery has to offer people. It's kind of an oasis away from the hustle and bustle of the city, um, um, and a way for you to sort of get quiet, to sort of develop a disposition of listening to God. Um, so I would say that's the first challenge for young people is, um, can I get to a place where I can actually hear the voice of God? And in my experience, when I hear that small, still voice, it never happens up here. It always happens in my heart. And that's kind of where I first felt the call to come to the monastery. This kind of silent, gentle, sort of nudging kind of voice. Um, and so that's a big challenge for young people. And I also think that, and this is particular to maybe this generation, that you have so many choices as a young person of what you can do. We were talking about, like, Vision Vocation Network as like a dating service for vocations before, but like you can relate it to modern dating now. Our parents' generation, their sort of potential spouses were like people who live near them, or people who they were sort of introduced to randomly, maybe at work or whatever. Now, I can you can go online and you can meet somebody from Switzerland in 5 minutes. Uh, you know, and of course, philosophically, the more choice you have, the harder it is to make the choice. Um, and so I think the amount of options young people have is a really difficult thing for them. It might seem on the surface like that's more freeing, but I would actually argue that it's not. Um, and that's why you really have to start with Jesus and what he's saying to you and what he wants you to do. Once you start to stray from that, I think you start to, get yourself in a little trouble, or open yourself up to the potential for that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I agree with. I think the voice of God, and like one of the questions I have on here is like, what would you say to someone who wants to grow closer to God? And I feel like you actually just kind of sum that up very succinctly. I feel like the voice of God is universal. Like when you see people helping other human beings, when you're watching like love being expressed, generosity, charity, like I think that like that breaks all languages, all barriers. Like you can see if somebody who is being a good Samaritan, you don't need to speak the same language as them to see that. Like somebody who's doing that in another country or another culture, like that's all coming from the same place, right? So when I
Yeah,
think of the voice of God, I think of that. I'm like, what's a universal like language that like defies all culture and all everything, and it doesn't matter where you place someone, that act itself is God in motion. I think that that's a really nice point that you made, that it comes from in here, not up here.
yeah,
And that's another thing that I think pivots into there's so many choices, right? That's where you get really muddled. You present too many choices, that really muddles you up here. back in the 40s, if you were sitting around with your family, you were listening to the radio, that's where you were getting all your information from. Like, you all were getting the same stream of information from the same place at the same time with the same people. Now it's like algorithms put you into an echo chamber, right? And then you've got too many options in that echo chamber, and it's all over the place. So that's another thing that I would like to pivot to my next question. So you have families, right, who are generationally all over the place. You have parents who came from that world that I'm talking about, where they were kids and they sat down and listened to the radio or watched the television, and it was coming from one source, right? You've got kids in this generation who are hearing all kinds of things from all different. You have people in our age group who kind of grew up with a little bit of one and then kind of grew into this age of where there's too many options almost, right? So you have all these different generations living in the same household who are experiencing kind of this spectrum of um, maybe like spiritual connection or disconnection. How would you encourage families to have a deeper prayer life at home, especially when life feels like disconnected in that way? Everybody's on a different path. Everybody's in a different level in their lives. Everybody's from a different generation, and you've got all this busyness going around, right? How would you encourage people to come together as a family to pray?
To me, it has to be intentional. You can just like sort of say, I want to grow closer to God, or I want my family to grow closer to God. It's certainly something it's easy to say, but you have to be intentional about prioritizing it, so that, that could mean, hey, here's the new house rule. We're going to get up every day at 7 in the morning, and we're going to pray before we eat breakfast and get ready for school or whatever. Um, I there, you hear some people say like, I don't have time to pray and things like that. It's like, but when you really sort of sit back and dissect your day and what you do during the day, you find out that you definitely have time to pray. Uh, you know, uh, Even something as silly as like, taking a bathroom break at work, you have time to pray. And while you take that half-hour walk when you get home or whatever, you have time to pray. And that's one of the great things about prayer, is that it can take so many different forms, and that you can do it while you're doing other things. You can do it while you're folding laundry. You can do it while you're whatever, cleaning the kitchen table. Um, so I guess the short answer is, you have to be intentional, and it has to be a daily priority. And I think the daily part is very important too, because if you don't have any sense of consistency to it, maybe your commitment to it starts to sort of wane, and you fall back into what you were doing before. So intention and consistency are the two most important things, I'd say.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, like you said, if anybody can make time to do anything, you can take time to have a couple minutes of prayer, right? Um, so I guess to wrap this up, because we have a few more minutes left, but and I have a couple, but this is probably like one of the more important ones I'd want to wrap up with you. If there's one message about Mary or the church in general that you wish more people understood, what would that be?
For Mary, it's that she's an example of how to live a holy life, kind of period, end of story. And that Mary is not someone that Catholics quote unquote worship, right? She's someone that we honor. Um, and For the church in general, this is kind of something I talked about. We had a former monk here named Brother Finbar, who's now a monk at St. Vincent in Latrobe, and probably will be ordained in the next couple of years. Um, and We had a lot of friends who either were, born Catholic and kind of fell away, or maybe aren't into organized religion or things like that, or relatives that sort of, say like, religion, it's all about money, blah, blah, blah. And to me, it's like, if you just take the fact that the church has been around for 2,000 years, it's persevered that long, and people still pay attention to it and gather in it. I think that's good evidence that it has something to say. Um, you may not agree with everything it says, but the fact that it's been around so long is evidence that it's an important institution. And I would argue the most important institution that we have.